All was not well with Sylvester Stallone's career in the summer of 1995. Judge Dredd had come out, and despite blockbuster business overseas, the film flopped in the all-important North American market. It would kick off a dry spell in Stallone's career, with many of his follow-up movies also doing poorly, to the point that in the early 2000s, he was stuck doing low-rent movies that went direct-to-video, such as Shade and Avenging Angelo. Of course, a major comeback for the Italian stallion was just around the corner, but in this episode of Stallone Revisited, we look back at his follow-up to Judge Dredd, Assassins, which, on paper, should have been one of Sly's classics, but has gone on to become something of an obscure, underrated outing on his CV.
I beat you to the buyers. Now, I beat you to the mark. I'm sorry, but I think I picked the wrong guy to be my hero.
Who's your contractor, Miguelito?
Why don't you drive? We can get acquainted. Chit-chat.
In the 1990s, spec scripts were all the rage. For those who don't know, a spec script is when a writer completes an entire screenplay on their own and sells it to a major studio. In the 90s, writers like Shane Black and Joe Esterhaus sold their completed scripts for The Long Kiss Goodnight and Basic Instinct for millions of dollars. For a brief period, screenwriters became rock stars, and the Wachowskis, before they ever directed a frame, became two of the hottest writers in town when they sold not one but two spec scripts to mega producer Joel Silver for $1 million apiece. One was The Matrix, and the other was Assassins. Back in the 90s, Assassins was considered a very, very commercial screenplay, while The Matrix was considered very risky. But indeed, this one became a pricey flop despite seeming like a home run on the page. Indeed, the script had many interested parties, with Mel Gibson, then the king of action at Warner Brothers, originally interested in both directing and starring in the film before getting too busy with Braveheart and passing it along to his mentor, Richard Donner. Richard Donner, of course, was himself something of an icon, having directed The Lost Boys and the Lethal Weapon movies. The screenplay centered around a deadly game of cat and mouse between two rival hitmen, the older, experienced Robert Rath and the wild, deadly upstart Miguel Bain. Every big male actor in Hollywood at some point had their name in contention, with the Wachowskis maintaining that the part of Robert Rath had been designed for Sean Connery.
Retired, of course.
The idea was to make this a two-hander with two big stars in the roles, and indeed in 1995 the two leading men, Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas, were likely seen as a can't-miss prospect. At the time, Stallone was coming off of Cliffhanger and Demolition Man, while The Specialist had done pretty good business too. Judge Dredd hadn't actually hit theaters at this point.
The law doesn't make mistakes.
Meanwhile, Banderas' star was still rising, with his hit movie Desperado opening just a few months before Assassins finally did. Stallone and Banderas got along famously well, and they both loved the director, Richard Donner. Plus, they had rising star Julianne Moore playing the love interest.
Hey, be careful, partner.
What went wrong? If you read Richard Donner's authorized biography, he admits to a few things going wrong. For one thing, he did not hit it off with the Wachowskis one bit. The duo had written a graphically violent script that Donner had no interest in turning into a film, begging the question, why was he hired in the first place? Instead, he brought in writer Brian Helgeland to do a major rewrite which would make Stallone's Robert Rath a much more likable hero, and in a fatal move, he excised most of the action in the screenplay in favor of turning the film into more of a neo-noir rather than a high-voltage action movie, which it had been designed as. He wanted to put out a movie that would feature one of Stallone's best ever dramatic performances, proudly telling interviewers that in this one, Stallone would only kill two people, and only to save his life, begging the question, why make Stallone a hitman? Indeed, Donner toyed with the idea of making Robert Rath a cop, something the Wachowskis were not keen on, proving that in the end the director just did not mesh with the material and tried hard to turn it into something that it just was never meant to be.
You're going slow. Antiquado.
I'm not the one shooting at mirrors, son.
Indeed, in Donner's book, it's mentioned that in post-production, all involved realized they had made a dull film, especially once they saw Luc Besson's The Professional.
If it leaves your mouth, I pull the trigger, capisci?
That's why the original score by Michael Kamen got ditched at the 11th hour in favor of a more action-driven score by Mark Mancina. The film was a box office flop, making under $30 million in North America, and indeed, when it opened, the trades were full of stories about how Stallone's star power had dimmed. Overseas, of course, the film was a lot more successful, as Stallone's star power was still going pretty strong, with it making an extra $50 million, meaning the film grossed about $83 million worldwide. It actually lost quite a bit of money, and Stallone's paycheck for the film had been a huge $15 million, and Hollywood at this point was wondering whether or not Stallone was still worth the massive paychecks.
Quit your job, you're having thoughts you never had before. Sounds like a midlife crisis to me.
So how does the movie hold up? While a lot of people watching this series have written me to say that they were looking forward to this episode, I never really loved Assassins as a movie. I don't mind it, but the late Richard Donner, who is one of my favorite directors, was not immune to misfires. He made a couple of really bad movies around this point, particularly Timeline, and I think that his conspiracy theory film is a bit of a mess.
You're telling me that NASA is going to kill the President of the United States with an earthquake.
Not exactly the kind of thing a Secret Service agent can, just throw himself on top of.
Heck, I don't even really like Lethal Weapon 4 all that much.
They're promoting you. Captain Reeves. Captain Murtaugh.
So this was not really his best period for movies. His effort to make it into a classy thriller out of what was probably always meant to be a gum-chewing action B-movie went wrong right off the bat with its pretentious, dull staging. Stallone dials it down a lot, too much so, to the point that he seems like he's depressed throughout the entire movie, which I guess his character is, but who wants to watch that on the screen? He's playing a world-weary hitman, emphasis on the weary, and I remember as a child watching this movie and just wishing that Stallone would lighten up a bit. I missed, the smiling Sly. Heck, even in Cobra, he smiles more than he does in this movie.
I'll kill her! I'll blow this whole place up!
Go ahead. I don't shot her.
His chemistry with the great Julianne Moore also isn't there, with her role as a hacker being targeted with only Sly to protect her feeling shoehorned in. It's like Hollywood at the time just really was uncomfortable about making a movie that didn't have some kind of love interest. So you get one, but their chemistry is non-existent. That said, the movie does have one significant saving grace, and that's Antonio Banderas. Despite being new on the scene, Banderas goes all out as far as scenery chewing goes.
I had to try. Who knows? Maybe it wasn't made in America. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa.
And if the movie has a pulse at all, it's because of him. His wild, over-the-top performance has given birth to a lot of internet memes, but he's the one that emerged from the film with his star power intact, with him signing on to do The Mask of Zorro not long after. Indeed, Banderas and Stallone would reunite a couple of times, with them doing Spy Kids 3 together, and eventually The Expendables 3. Donner, in his later years, said that if he could do the film over again, he would have switched the roles, with Sly playing the bad guy and Banderas playing the hero, which, to be honest, might have actually been a lot better. In the end, it's pretty obvious why Assassins flopped, because even though it was marketed as an action flick, it was a psychological thriller, exactly the type of film Stallone's fans at the time didn't want to see him in. And while it's slickly made, I give it a 6 out of 10 Stallones. Never one of my favorites, although I do think that, there are good things about it. One would think that its failure would have driven Sly back to his action movie comfort zone, but his next film, Daylight, would be another attempt to stretch, with him diving into the disaster movie genre, which at the time was red hot at the box office in the wake of Twister. Sadly, its release would miss the trend by just a couple of months, but that's a story for another time.
It was very nice meeting you, Robert Rath.
It's very dangerous meeting you, Miguel Bay.